Hi, I'm Raymond Simonson. I'm the CEO of JW3, London's Jewish Community Centre and the UK's only Jewish arts and culture venue of its kind. Sadly, as you know, we've had to temporarily close our doors at the moment. We've got to think about people's health and safety, and we're listening to government advice. But just because we've stopped doing what we normally do in the way that we do it, it doesn't mean we have to completely stop what we're doing and what we're best at. And that is to increase the quality, variety, and volume of Jewish conversation in London and beyond. So we've got some treats for you. We are going to put on a whole load of our digital archive that we've been building up over the last 6 years of some amazing events. We're going to make them absolutely free of charge to you. And whilst you sit down with a cup of tea and put your feet up and watch this amazing thing you're about to see now, our team are going to be planning for a whole bunch of events that we're going to put on digitally over the coming months. For now, this one's on us, it's free. But you know, everything that we do costs money. And at the moment, we don't have the same income streams that we've got. So if you can spare a few pennies, a few shekels, if you can click donate online, that'll be really wonderful. We'd be so grateful for it. If you can do that, that's great. But either way, please sit back and enjoy. We'll see you again soon.
Good morning everyone. Thank you for coming through this, what they say is going to be the hottest day on record in Britain. May I say, however, I am most put out by those of you, I have to say mainly female, who have commented that I am not wearing a tie. I have to say this is probably the first time in 50 years in adult education I have not worn a tie. But unlike some of the gentlemen in the room, I haven't gone as far as shorts. But if we're going to get over 40, who knows, it may be bathing trunks. You know the CEO here, and he was saying as I arrived this morning, well, can you make sure your students know that during the coffee break, the water is being replaced in the paddling pool outside by pure undiluted gin to get me through. I thought that was a nice gesture by JW3. So welcome. We here in Britain are now reaching the end game. The end game of Brexit, certainly, one way or the other. We're now reaching the end game of the United Kingdom, quite possibly, with the situation in both Scotland and Northern Ireland running out of Westminster government control. And for me, most interestingly perhaps of all, as a historian, we are now reaching the end game of the 1688-1714 constitutional settlement. That is now inevitable, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others as well. We are in rough seas here in Britain. Interesting to be in rough seas, but hopefully there is calm water beyond. We, however, may not live long enough, some of us, to see the calm water. Who knows? But we're not alone here in Britain, because the crisis isn't just a British crisis, it's a European crisis as a whole. And Europe is equally challenged, if not more so, as we'll see in a minute. When I thought about how did I begin, I thought about Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland. And Lewis Carroll provides me with a suitable warning as I begin this quite complicated day in some ways. Lewis Carroll wrote, "You're old, Father William," the young man said, "and your hair has become very white, and yet you incessantly stand on your head. Do you think, at your age, it is right?" Well, you may think I'm going to do the academic equivalent of standing on my head today. Taking such a wide-ranging, important, and yet at the same time worrying topic of European crisis is a risk. Not least because many of you are likely to disagree with some of the things that I may say. And from past experience, some of you will disagree with everything that I say. But it's right and proper and entirely natural that you should disagree. But we absolutely must, all of us, if we believe in democracy, and of our grandchildren's future engage with these questions and come to a satisfactory answer for each one of us. Europe in crisis, I called the day. In many ways, of course, you could say Europe has always been in crisis. Because politically, socially, economically, the situation in Europe has never in history been static. Some of you, like me, years ago, did European history at A-level. And you know that there was barely a time when anything in Europe was not in crisis. But even so, the present situation politically in Europe and all the things socially and economically that flow from that political situation is indeed, I think, one of crisis. Or, if you prefer to be a little bit more pedantic, at least a near crisis. What specific issues relating to Europe might be listed as critical? Well, first of all, Brexit, because it affects the European Union and the rest of Europe in ways that we can't tell, in the same way that we can't tell how it will affect us. But that it will affect Europe is clear. It's clear. Economically, of course, the Germans are horrified that we will not be contributing to the EU budget in the way that we did if we come out. But it also means, in terms of Europe, that a voice of democracy is silenced at the highest chambers within Europe. We are, pretty well, the only country that has not suffered revolution since the end of the 17th century. Our democracy can be traced right back to Saxon times. Our democracy is deep, deep in our DNA. In Europe, with the exception of the Weimar Republic, Germany has only been united for what? 30 years. 30 years. France? Well, France has remained a basket case since 1789. And don't even go to Spain or Italy. And after that, your small nations, they will miss us. And not just economically. They will miss us in enormous other ways that they haven't even begun to think about. As we, of course, will miss them in ways that we have not thought about. So Brexit is a major crisis for Europe as a whole. And then the EU has other problems simply than Britain. Can the European Union survive with the growth of, well, neo-fascism and populism in former Eastern Europe, with the danger of that spreading into Western Europe? Think of Germany. Think of France, with serious issues over neo-fascism and populism. And then, of course, for us, as well as the rest of Europe, there's Russia. Will Putin's belligerence lead to further clashes with the West this time? We avoided them over Crimea, and so far we've avoided them over East Ukraine and Georgia. But was he to threaten the Baltic states? That's a different matter, for they are members of NATO. And then there's immigration, which affects us as well as Europe. Is it even controllable anymore? Can we stop the flood of immigrants from the Sahel in North Africa? Well, we might, but it doesn't look as though we are. And hovering above all of those questions, hovering above all of those political questions, is the dark and menacing cloud of environmental Armageddon, for which the politicians here and elsewhere in Europe are hardly prepared. We are, well, arguably the most prepared of all, Well, if we're the most prepared, God help Europe. So we're facing numerous crises in Europe. But the West is facing crises as well, not just Europe. We think of North America, the United States, Canada. We think of Australia and New Zealand. We think of the West as a whole is facing crisis. And on your reading list, I put a work of fiction, which has just been published in paperback by Vince Flynn called Red War. It's about an imaginary president of Russia, but it is very much based upon Putin and is an excellent read. And in that book, Red War, Vince Flynn writes this: Britain has left the European Union behind. Poland, Turkey, and Hungary are moving back towards authoritarianism, and America is pulling back from its leadership role in the world with its democracy in turmoil. In many ways, the West is as weak as it's been in modern history. I think that's pretty accurate, actually. I think that's pretty accurate. Twice in the last 3/4 of a century, and then for many of us, not everybody, but for the majority of us, that's our own lifetimes. Europe has had to reform itself twice. Twice. We bring back into this room, through a time capsule, adults of the 1920s, even more, adults of the 1910s, and they wouldn't recognize Europe. In our own lifetimes, Europe has been reformed at the end of the Second World War in 1945, and reformed by an iron curtain, to borrow Churchill's phrase, dividing Western democratic Europe from Eastern Marxist authoritarian Europe. And we lived most of our lives with the threat in the Cold War that such a war would be a hot war, and that Russia would launch missiles at us and we would launch missiles at them, and we were protected in that period of time by Uncle Sam. Whether Uncle Sam would be prepared to protect Europe again, and whether Uncle Sam would be prepared to protect Europe without Britain again, who can tell? But Europe is not as we had designed it to be post-1945, because those Eastern Marxist regimes fell in 1989. And the world changed again, and Europe changed again. And again, the map of Europe was redrawn. And every time it's been redrawn, after the defeat of Napoleon, after the defeat of the Kaiser, after the defeat of Nazi Germany, and after the defeat, the collapse of Eastern Europe, everyone has had a honeymoon period in which everything was going to be wonderful. And if you were British, if everything's going to be wonderful, we always look back at a time through rose-tinted spectacles when we thought it was wonderful. That's the message, of course, being sold by Boris as we sit here. A back to the future message. Well, history doesn't quite work out like that. It's not easy to predict from history what will happen in the future. But I wanted to start with 1989, as it says on your handout, with new hopes dashed. But first of all, a little piece from an excellent book by an American, George Friedman's book, Flashpoints. And in the introduction to this book, in his very opening paragraph of his preface, Friedman writes about the period before 1945. And he writes, between 1914 and 1945, roughly 100 million Europeans died from political causes: war, genocide, purges, planned starvation, and all the rest. between 1914 and 1945, the two world wars. 100 million Europeans died for political causes: war, genocide, purges, planned starvation, and all the rest. And as you all know, humankind killed more of its own in the 20th century than all the other centuries added together. And we think we're so much better, and we think we're improving. Well, that was the Victorian myth that has long been dispelled. Oh yeah, of course things get better. We enjoy better health and better health services. But humankind itself is still capable of the most dreadful things. Who would have thought in the second decade of the 21st century that a leading British political party could have got itself enmeshed in issues of anti-Semitism? Who could have imagined such a thing? Friedman goes on to say, this figure of 100 million Europeans would be an extraordinary number of deaths anywhere and at any time. But it was particularly striking in Europe, which had, over the course of the previous 400 years, collectively conquered most of the world and reshaped the way humanity thought of itself. Now, there are many who think that Europe's place in the sun, which began with the explorations that went out first of all from Portugal and Spain, and then from Britain or England, France and Holland, that those expansions across the world, which began in the 16th century in Portugal's case and Spain's in the late 15th century, placed Europe at the top of the pile. Well, maybe in 200 years' time, historians will say, well, the end of Europe's domination began with its mass killing of its own people in the two world wars of the 20th century, and the subsequent loss of European empires, including, of course, the largest, the British Empire. Wow. There's a lot to take on board, but maybe they're right. Maybe Europe's place in the sun is declining. And certainly that in terms of Britain is something we have to be far more aware of than we've ever been aware of in our lifetimes. That our politicians have to come to terms with what sort of nation are we? What sort of nation do we want to be? Where do we see ourselves in the grand scheme of things? This is not to do with Brexit. In or out of Brexit's another issue. But where does Britain see itself? Hopefully, one day we will get a Prime Minister that begins to answer that question, because we've certainly been waiting since 1945 for an answer. So then, when does modern or contemporary European history begin? You can make a case, of course, for 1945, and many historians write about modern Europe and begin the story with the defeat of Hitler and the end of the Second World War, but I think now that doesn't hold water. I think much better date is 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, that iconic moment, that iconic symbol for the end of Marxist Eastern Europe. What a moment that was as we watched on the television people with their own hands dismantling that wall. Or you remember that ghastly man, Ceausescu, and the more ghastly wife in Romania, which was beamed at us on Christmas Day of all days, losing power as we watched live from Bucharest. Nobody ever thought this Cold War, this division of Europe, would suddenly collapse like a house of cards. We thought this was the new order in Europe that would last centuries. And yet it collapsed, if not overnight, pretty well the next best thing. 1989 and the fall of Eastern European communism is the beginning of the modern story, the contemporary story of Europe that we are living through today. This is Simon Jenkins's book, A Short History of Europe, I'm always attracted to books which have the word short in the title, but this is an extremely good book and very interesting and beautifully written. And he writes here, the world watched mesmerised as the once mighty Soviet Empire gave a sigh, tottered and collapsed. It vanished in just over a year. No one had predicted it, and the surprise was total. Europeans had, for half a century, taken for granted a divided Germany and a divided Europe. The Gulf seemed a permanent shadow across the map of the continent. In terms both sides were careful not to use, the West had won the Cold War. Gorbachev shrewdly called it our common victory. Without a shot fired in anger, other than briefly in Romania. It will be very difficult, I think, to explain to younger people how those of us that grew up in the shadow of the bomb, do you remember at school and sixth form, everlastingly having debates about the bomb, ban the bomb, drop the bomb, whatever, cook the bomb, whatever, it was always the bomb. It was always the threat of nuclear Armageddon. And it went. Just disappeared. Like snow in May. It was there one moment and not the next. And it wasn't our victory. What it was the implosion of the East. And it's interesting to reflect on why it imploded. Because as people in the East, inevitably in an increasingly modern technological world, knew more about the West, was it political? Did they all want to vote Tory or Labour? No. What they wanted was washing machines and fridges and holidays in the sun. That's what people wanted. And in the end, with the failure of the communist regimes to provide people with what they wanted, the whole thing collapsed. There's a moral there for all politicians. In fact, the Japanese-American historian Francis Fukuyama wrote, what we may be witnessing at the time of the collapse of Eastern Europe, what we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. Sometimes academics can say the most stupid things. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization, if you use long words, you must be clever, and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. And what is that worth today? Absolutely nothing. Rubbish. Total, complete rubbish. No end of history. No victory of liberal democracy. Wow. True, the Cold War had ended, but as we've just seen, the West didn't win it. The East merely imploded. But democratic Europe and America were jubilant. We'd won the war. We'd won the war. Simon Jenkins writes in this form. To the West, the new order after 1989 was a moment of exhilaration. The American political scientist, as we've just seen, Francis Fukuyama, declared it the end of history. He said that the world had reached the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western democracy as the final form of human government. In retrospect, this was naive, but it reflected a widespread optimism that swept across Europe in the 1990s, a repeat of the fin de siècle exhilaration of the 1890s. It was as if Europe's evolution had reached a sort of apotheosis, or at least become uninteresting. Wow. You see, optimism, Mr. Johnson, isn't everything. Optimism has to be based in reality. and not just some blind hope. We would all prefer to be optimistic than pessimistic. Of course we would. But the truth is that optimism also comes at a price. And we took our eye off the ball. If, for those of you who follow football, a football analogy may be worth making. In the FA Cup, a Premier League side is drawn against a Division 2 side. So cocky are they, that they go into the match thinking this is just a walk in the sun, and find to their shock that at half-time they're losing 2-0. And in the second half they can't pull the match back, and they lose. Their optimism was misplaced. Because they had a right to be optimistic, but only if they put effort into it. We were right to be optimistic in 1989, 1990. But did we put effort into it? No. We sat back and congratulated ourselves. And we didn't notice. We didn't notice that by 2000, Putin had come to power in Russia. And Putin was no Gorbachev. And Putin was no Yeltsin. And Putin was no Liberal Democrat. We had taken our eyes off the ball. Some of you will know without me telling you that Mrs. Thatcher was the only leading Western politician who issued a note of warning over German reunification. She has reputedly told Chancellor Kohl, "We beat the Germans twice, and now they're back." And she had to be restrained by Hurd, Foreign Secretary, and others in the use of her language. But from the standpoint of 2019, and looking at Europe, and the position of the extreme populist right as the second most powerful party in Germany, with the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany again, etc., etc., Mrs. Thatcher doesn't seem so out of kilter with the truth and with the facts as she did when she said them. Sometimes politicians are not always, it's always said politicians are thought worse of over the years because people dig up all the sort of dreadful stories about them. It'll be interesting, won't it, to read about Boris, if you're interested in that sort of thing, because without the news of the world, we shall be dependent upon an early biography. But sometimes politicians can be thought better of. And in this case, I think many people would think Mrs. Thatcher was right to issue a warning. Wow. So, people like Fukuyama, people like President of the United States, President of France, Chancellor of Germany, were blind to the fact that optimism has to be worked at. And the idea of Fukuyama's, which was held by all of these politicians, that it was the triumph of liberal democracy, has certainly not come to pass. And we've seen the re-emergence of a European, indeed a British, populist right, and worse, a further right. And in places like Hungary, a neo-fascist right. We've seen the rise of the right across Europe, and not simply in Eastern Europe, Italy, Germany, France. Wow. So 1989, from these further years we've lived through, in 2019 doesn't look like the victory it looked like, or we wanted it to look like. Don't jest. Don't just think it's good because you want it to be good. And that, of course, is a danger with populists. And that's why many people feel uneasy about Johnson. Let's be clear. What do we mean by populism? And what do we mean by fascism? There's been a lot of thought put into this academically in America for very obvious reasons. Is Trump a fascist? Well, you've heard members of Congress describing the president as a fascist. But is he a fascist? Is he a populist? Is he a populist whose populism could lead to fascism? This is a professor from New York, Federico Finkelstein. And Finkelstein obviously is looking at Donald Trump in America, but he's trying to extract from the story of Trump basic ideas. What is populism that you can apply? So you can apply this, if you like, Boris Johnson. The first is a division of society into two camps, the people and the elite. Well, that's Trump. That's Trump. It's all these people. But have we not heard about that sort of division in Britain? Well, not perhaps from Johnson, but from others. But the people and the elite, is that not one of the issues about Brexit? Where people voted against the advice of both major political parties and of all living prime ministers and of all chancellors of the Exchequer, living chancellors of the Exchequer bar one. The division of society into the people and the elite, that's dangerous. That's dangerous for a rise of populism, and it's dangerous here. A proud antagonism towards intellectuals. Michael Gove, of all people, made really damaging comments about professional advice. And Boris Johnson's man of the moment, his advisor in number 10, is on record as attacking civil servants on the grounds that they aren't bright enough, well, really, that they aren't giving the sort of advice he wants to give. I was amazed to hear on the BBC them asking a retired senior civil servant, well, how will the senior civil servants deal with the ministers? Because if they tell them about the problems of Brexit, that wouldn't go down well. And I thought, what world do we live in? I've never worked in central government, only in local government. But I was told when I worked in local government in Warwickshire a long time ago, and I was an inspector for further and adult education, and I had to appear before committees of the council, the advice given me before I went to the first one by the chief education officer was, you must tell it as you see it. Don't change your opinion to fit any of the politicians that are sat there. You must tell them the truth, and they must then make their judgment. They may disregard your view entirely, but you must make clear what your view is, and you must be prepared to substantiate it, obviously. So what an awful thing for the BBC to report that senior civil servants might be thinking last night, well, I daren't go and tell the minister that. I better sort of, really? Is that really is that what we've come to? Because that's worrying. And the third thing that Finkelstein points out is the rejection of culture and knowledge in favour of instinct. Well, if the cat fits. The promotion of polarising views. Well, we've certainly seen that in our society. The demonisation of one's opponent. A contempt for judiciary, military and political powers, and a strong intolerance of a free press. Well, we see evidence of that in both our major political parties in Britain. And maybe Johnson is, on some continuum, a step further towards populism than we've ever seen in a Labour or Conservative Prime Minister since 1945. We've never seen someone. The language he uses is the language of the populace. Some of you said this morning you thought his speech was excellent. Well, it certainly was different. And there is an attraction to that. But think for a moment, those of you who are my age, can you imagine Churchill or Attlee making such a speech on becoming Prime Minister? And the answer is no, you can't. But does it matter? Or has the world changed? And am I just being foolish? And are the Americans concerned about Trump being foolish? And Finkelstein says, look, it doesn't matter. Populism doesn't automatically lead to fascism. Don't panic. Populism may simply be a trend that disappears. But of course, you have to be careful. Behind Johnson may be Farage. And behind Farage, who knows? But we're not there. So why panic? Well, because we've got to be careful. As Churchill said, we must be vigilant in the defense of democracy. And we have to be particularly vigilant in Britain because the alternative government is arguably less democratic, as we shall see later, than the current government. And we've never been in that position before. So what about fascism? Finkelstein says the one thing that distinguishes fascism is the use of violence. And he goes on to say, think of 1933 in Germany. It expresses itself as street violence first. Well, you're seeing that in the United States. And not condemned by the president. Oh, well, meekly, but not condemned. And we've gone a long way towards advocating that through John McDonnell of the Labour Party. Not necessarily, he doesn't use the word violence, he uses the word direct action on the streets. And then Finkelstein says it begins with street violence, and then through the militarization of the government, think Nazi Germany. Think people suddenly appearing in uniforms, or think Moses Britain. And then think of the attacks made on particular groups of people. Think Kristallnacht in Germany. And then the running of Nazi Germany as a paramilitary state. Oh, we're nowhere near that, of course, in Britain. But in America, where we've seen street violence and not necessarily condemned, that appalling scene of the Republicans screaming for those Congresswomen, women who are American born and bred, 3 of them, and 1 American naturalized, to be thrown out of the country. I don't have to say in this audience, surely, why we should be so worried about that sort of thing. How we should be so deeply worried. So, one of the problems Europe faces is the rise of the far right and of Salvini, the Italians' attempt to create such a grouping within the European Parliament. And indeed to seek for high office within the European Union for members of far-right groups. Orban in Hungary, Salvini in Italy. Well, the Italians aren't going to be. Can you just remember Mussolini, please? Can you just remember Mussolini? Mm-hmm. And Hungary. Lots of you have been to Budapest. Many of you will have been to what they call the House of Horrors, which I just couldn't bring myself to go to. Used in the war by the Gestapo. Used after the war by the Marxist secret police. And in very many cases, the same men. They took off the swastika and put on the Marxist hammer. Same people, just change their uniform. Wow. Is there hope? Yes, of course there's hope. And the hope is that democratic ideals in Europe, not least as advocated by Britain, are more firmly established now than they were in 1933. After all, Germany, post-1945, large parts of it, were denazified by British people. My predecessor as principal of the College of Adult Education in Manchester, Ronnie Wilson, was one of those involved in a denazification program. And he established democratic trade unions in Hessen, and he established adult education, liberal, in Hessen. We did it. Let me remind you that this is the democratic heart of Europe. Not Athens, not Rome, and certainly not Brussels. We are. But of course, it looks as though our voice will be silenced shortly. And our voice won't be heard. Some of you have heard me tell this story before, but like all reasonably good stories, it's worth repeating. I was a member of a Council of Europe, not European Union, Council of Europe adult education cross-European group meeting in Strasbourg, and I was elected by my peers as the chair of a group which was looking at adult education and older people. And at the coffee break, one of the Eurocrats came up to me, who was French. I'm sorry to say, I thought my luck was in. She was most attractive. And said, could I buy you a coffee, Monsieur Tyler? I thought, I'm in. Yes, I said, in my most charming way. Only for her to say, I'm so glad you were elected as chair. She said, it makes my life so much easier if an Englishman is in the chair. And I said, why? She said, well, all I have to do is to take notes and send them to everyone, and no one disagrees. So I said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, surely the French chair a meeting. But she said, oh, no, the French don't. She said, if the French chair a meeting, we never get a decision. And so we have to make up the decision and hope no one notices. And this is absolutely true. When we send the minutes round, I said, well, what about the Germans? And she said, oh, no, the Germans are even worse. They've decided on the decision before the meeting begins. She said, only the British actually conduct a meeting properly and get an agreement, a compromise agreement at the end. Now, a silly story, but actually says something about the role of Britain within the European Union, and our voice won't be there. There's a book on the book list I put, which is Paddy Ashdown. You'll be pleased to know I'm stopping in about half a minute. There's a fantastic piece by Paddy Ashdown in his book. He wrote a book about those who stood up against Hitler. It's the last thing pretty well he did before he's dead. And he wrote, in reading this book, you may be struck as I was in writing it, by the similarities between what happened in the build-up to World War II and the age in which we now live. Then as now, nationalism and protectionism were on the rise, and democracies were seen to have failed. People hungered for the government of strong men. Those who suffered most from the pain of economic collapse felt alienated and turned towards simplistic solutions and strident voices. Fake news built around the convincing untruth carried more weight in the public discourse than rational arguments and provable facts. Paddy Ashdown. I have a soft spot for Paddy Ashdown. I once gave him a job, and then he turned it down. With that little thought, we'll stop for a cup of coffee, and we'll come back. Though we've not been before, we come back when the sort of spirit moves. It's rather like sheep. Two people start moving, and then everyone follows them back in. It's about quarter an hour, 20 minutes or so, and we'll start again. Right, folks, here we go. I ended just before coffee with a quotation from Paddy Ashdown, who was concerned about the future of liberal democracy. And you remember that I said also that Fukuyama, after 1989, said that it was the final victory of liberal democracy. Well, it isn't. Vladimir Putin has made it quite clear not only that he believes liberal democracy has failed, but of course he's absolutely over the moon that it's failed. And some of you will have read his recent interview in the Financial Times. And in the Financial Times, Putin trumpeted the growth of national populist movements in Europe and America, and saying that liberalism is spent as an ideological force. Liberal democracy is dead. Forget about 1989 and the victory of liberal democracy, Western democracy. Putin says it's failed, and national populist movements are growing. And of course the problem with Putin is not only are they growing, but they're growing thanks to Russian money or Russian interference in general elections. The next general election here could be very, very interesting in terms of how we monitor Russian funding. Russian funding to John McDonnell seems more than possible. Russian funding through whatever to Boris Johnson doesn't seem entirely impossible. Liberals, that's Avril's voice, I can hear. Liberals said Putin cannot simply dictate anything to anyone, just like they have been attempting to do over recent decades. He means since 1989 and the fall of communism. This was a most interesting interview in the Financial Times. Of course, the European Union, through Donald Tusk, said they strongly disagree with Mr. Putin. And Tusk said, what I find really obsolete is authoritarianism, personality cults, and the rule of oligarchs. Yes, but you might feel that that might apply to the European Union as much as it does to Russia. And you might think it's burying your head in the sand, as the Weimar Republic did with the rise of Nazism and indeed Marxism in the 20s and 30s in Germany. Don't be optimistic without having grounds to be optimistic. Putin said, echoing nationalist populists such as Mr. Salvini and France's Marine Le Pen, Putin said liberal governments had not acted to reassure citizens. Instead, they had pursued a mindless multiculturalism, embracing, among other things, sexual diversity. I like that reaction. Wow. Now, there'd be many people in Britain that would agree with that. There was an analysis by the Financial Times defence correspondent, Jonathan Marcus, to that interview by Putin, which is saying that liberal democracy is dead. And Marcus wrote, President Putin is a man who grew to maturity in the Soviet era and was a servant of the communist state. He was a member of the KGB, never forget. He regards the collapse of the Soviet Union as a tragedy and has sought to establish Russia as a counterweight to the liberal Western order. So, says Jonathan Marcus, to that extent, Putin's comments are hardly surprising. But Marcus goes on to say, Russia, though, with its relatively weak economy and many social problems, is hardly an example that many will want to follow. Nonetheless, where Mr. Putin's remarks carry some weight is that the liberal order established in the wake of World War II is under stress like never before. The ramifications of the financial crisis, populist currents inside many liberal democratic countries, Brexit, the rise of China as a major economic force, and a US president who many critics see as corrosive to the established American-led order, have combined to create a genuine sense of drift and unease. And I would say crisis. I would say crisis. You see, don't just dismiss those who disagree with you. Face up to their arguments and have arguments of your own. Don't just dismiss Putin as an authoritarian, anti-democratic dictator. But look at what he says. And Marcus seems to me to be right. There are some things that in Putin's analysis which are correct. That liberal democracy is under threat. From the financial crisis, which many commentators now think was the push towards Brexit, Brexit itself, populist currents, let alone neo-fascist currents in Europe, populist currents here in Britain, and the withdrawal of America into isolationism under Trump. Just look at the situation for one moment in the Gulf of Hormuz. Without America, we're nowhere. Well, there's the French Navy. Oh, well, there's. We simply don't have enough ships. Extraordinary. And what did Boris say? He's going to build ships. Well, this isn't the 18th century when you can build a wooden man of war in a matter of months. And most of the warships we've built since 1945 have anyhow not succeeded at first, like the present Queen Elizabeth II, which leaked. Brilliant British engineering to build a huge ship at multi-million pounds, and the bloody thing leaks. Excuse my French. There are big questions. And these are very serious questions. Do you think that Putin doesn't know that the Queen Elizabeth II leaks? I bet they put it on top of his intro. We'll come back to why that's important later today in terms of the Navy.
William, the fact is also that the populism doesn't only come from the right.
Oh no, populism doesn't only come from the right. It can come from the left as well.
Momentum's chief insult is to call somebody a neoliberal.
That's true. And as I said, we're fixated on the Conservative Party and on Johnson. But we should not, and I shall come back to this, we should not be under any illusions about the populist nature of the Labour Party leadership, and McDonnell in particular. Forget about Corbyn, he's totally unimportant. McDonnell is the problem, and he is decidedly a populist in a way very different from Johnson's populism. Populism comes in various forms, but it isn't a friend of liberal democracy. Not necessarily, it really isn't. I wrote a question under point 4 on your sheet. Will Rome fall again? And some of you think, what on earth is he on about? And what I'm on about is this. Every attempt at forming a European Union has failed in the past. Even the greatest attempt of all, the Roman Empire, in the end failed. P.S. What happened here in Britain when Rome withdrew in 410 AD? The dark. I mean, my dear, we can't even get the plumbing repaired. Well, why is there no heat on this floor? Well, the last plumber, went on the last ship to France or whatever it might have been done. We simply fell back as a civilization when the Romans left. You all know that, the Dark Ages we call it. We know very little of what went on. I'm not suggesting we fall back into a dark age, although that was a phrase used by Churchill, you remember in 1940, had we lost to Nazi Germany. But we have to be careful. So even the Romans fell. Cicero, I'm a great fan of Cicero. I'll read it in English. There are plenty here who do it in Latin. Cicero wrote, "This is Rome. Our city is a cesspool of humanity, a place of deceit, plots and vice of every imaginable kind. Anywhere you turn, you will see arrogance, stubbornness, malevolence, pride and hatred. Amid such a swirl of evil, it takes a remarkable man with sound judgment and great skill to avoid stumbling, gossip and betrayal." That can apply to Boris, but it can apply to the EU equally. The Roman Empire also imploded like Eastern Europe. Implosion is what you have to worry about. So the Roman Empire, the greatest unification of Europe, and since then we've always dreamed of a Roman Empire. There's wretched Mussolini conquering Ethiopia and being given a triumph in Rome as though he was Caesar. There's Hitler in Germany with all the paraphernalia around the Third Reich. And there's Charlemagne. Charlemagne, who tried to recreate the empire and failed. And here in Britain, we weren't part of Charlemagne's empire, but Offa, for God's sake, Offa, this tiny little king up in Lichfield for goodness sake, starts issuing gold coins because he wants to be the king of Europe. He wants to be recognised like Charlemagne. He writes letters to Charlemagne, offering his daughter or any woman he can find as brides to Charlemagne or Charlemagne's sons. It's all about... Where do you think the first Saxon king was crowned of England? In London? No, in Bath. In Bath. For those who've just woken up, I did not say in the bath. In Bath. Why Bath? Because Bath was the Roman city. That's why. They were claiming this inheritance. Well, Charlemagne's empire failed. The Holy Roman Empire failed. Napoleon's lasted a few years and failed. Germany's 2 attempts in the last century lasted a short periods of time and failed. Will the EU itself fail? Yes, of course it will. Of course it will. At some point, the EU will fail. In 1/4 of a century? Maybe. In a century? Maybe. In 2 centuries? In 4? Oh, come on. It's not going to be there in 200 years' time. It can't survive. It's not possible. But what immediate threats threaten the EU today? Well, internal threats. First of all, obviously, Brexit, the withdrawal of Britain. How can you have a European Union without Britain? It doesn't make sense. The rise of neo-fascism might break Europe in two. A democratic Western EU and a Northern EU and a Southern and Eastern fascist EU. And internally, the collapse of the euro. How long will Germany's electorate be prepared without Britain to go on paying for the likes of Greece? They're not going to do it. And then there's corruption. Corruption seems endemic. Corruption is endemic in the EU. Just look at Brexit MPs and before that UKIP MPs. You don't need to go any further. A lot of internal stresses within the European Union. And external, well, the economic external rise of China. And China's but the first of a non-European world, non-Western world, we count America, a non-Western world to emerge as an economic power. It might not just be China, South America, which is something we're going to be looking at next term. Africa, for goodness sake. The rise of new economic powers to challenge Europe. And how are we going to feed Europeans without importing? I've already made a stand. I no longer eat Spanish raspberries. Everyone looks at me in Sainsbury's or Tesco or wherever. I'm looking at the packet. I will only eat Moroccan or British. Well, I won't eat Kent because my wife can't. No. But I'm very careful what raspberries I eat. But we may not have a choice after Brexit. We may not have Spanish raspberries, but we have a much bigger food problem about Europe. As China and India begin to eat more meat, what are we going to do? Are we going to eat as... I know I live near Brighton and it's all trendy on the south coast, and we were encouraged to eat seaweed at a recent festival in Worthing. Well, I don't know about you, but one seaweed biscuit will see me through the rest of my life. Never again. We've got, facing Europe externally, the increasing belligerence of Russia. I'm going to come to that before lunch. The increasing belligerence of Russia. And then there's economic migration from Africa and even further afield from Asia. How do we cope with it? Okay, we're going to isolate ourselves, are we, on this island? Whilst Italy gradually sinks in the Mediterranean from the sheer weight of the people crossing from North Africa to Italy? How are we going to cope with that? And then above all of that, what about the environment? Well, we say it won't concern us, we'll all be dead by then, even the young ones may be dead by then. But what about the young ladies who are in this class this morning? What about their children and their grandchildren? What sort of world will they inhabit? Will we all be wearing gas masks because of the smog and the pollution? Will we all be eating processed vegetables? Seaweed. There are major problems facing Europe. And do you ever get a feeling that the EU is absolutely on top of all of these problems? Well, if you do, you're not reading the same news as I'm reading. Can Rome survive? This is an article by the historian Niall Ferguson, and it was in the Sunday Times in last Sunday of June this year. And Ferguson wrote, "The rise of the internet dooms the European federalist project as surely as it does the old political parties. A hierarchical structure recognisably 1950s prominence, the EU has proved unequal to the challenges of three network-propelled crises: the US-originated bank panic, the Arab revolutions, and the trans-Mediterranean migration surge. The political backlash against these failures, of which Brexit is just a part, has been a death sentence for the project of ever closer union." Interesting. I think it is interesting. And if you were doing a university course, that's your essay for the holiday. Is the European Union structures set fast in the 1950s? And federalism isn't an answer in the 2020s. Well, I think everybody except the French have abandoned the idea of federalism. I don't think you'll find many German politicians supporting the idea of federalism. And yet one of the reasons we left or are leaving the EU is because of federalism. But federalism is dead in the EU. I don't understand. Ferguson goes on to say, "A new generation of right-wing populists, of whom the most talented is Matteo Salvini of Italy's League Party, has worked out that it's easier to remain inside the European tent, but constantly to bitch about it, than to exit. Soon there will be enough populist governments to erect a permanent barrier to further integration inside the Council of Ministers. In any case, almost no North European leader takes seriously the proposals for European reform of Emmanuel Macron, the French president. He is the last federalist standing." Interesting, isn't it? Things are going so fast that I gave a similar day in Essex in June this year, and I thought, this is going to be easy coming today. I just read through my notes again, only to discover that many of them were out of date in a month and had to be thrown away, and others seemed irrelevant. This is something that I came across since I gave the previous talk. This is Charlemagne in The Economist. I'm sure lots of you read The Economist. For those of you who like to read sort of magazines and newspapers and want something informative and least biased, then The Economist is a recommended read. I'm sure lots of people here read The Economist, do they? People? Yeah. Well, I'm sure you'd all agree The Economist has excellent background articles. This is Charlemagne, which is the name used by the Economist reporter or in the journalist in Europe. And he wrote this on the 22nd of June this year. "The geometry of European power is becoming messy. For one thing, there are more splits. The old centre-right and centre-left families no longer span Europe." And is that not true of Britain itself? Centre-left? Well, forget about that with Jeremy Corbyn. Centre-right? Well, we're not sure where Boris may be going, but my ex-MP, Priti Patel, is certainly not centre-right. At the European Parliament election in May this year, the Conservatives were most successful in Central and South Eastern Europe. 8 of the 9 centre-right governments are now from east of the Rhine. The Social Democrats are rooted in Iberia and Scandinavia. Meanwhile, the newly powerful Liberal and Green groupings, in the parliament are strongest in Europe's north and west, while its right-wing populists are most successful in its east and south. And the Franco-German engine of Europe is stalling. So will Rome last? Will the EU last, with or without Britain? And the answer is no. Does it stand more chance of collapsing without Britain? Yes, clearly, because Germany will, in the end, pull the pin on it, because it can't afford to pay for everyone else. God knows what will happen in French politics. Many of you who come and hear me speak know that I'm of the opinion that France has not yet found a stable way forward politically since 1789. Well, just think about the history for a moment. Of all, the real successful attempt was the Fifth Republic of de Gaulle, but it looks increasingly as though the Fifth Republic won't manage to survive. So what's it's had? It's had 5 republics, it's had 2 empires, it's had absolute monarchy, it's had constitutional monarchy, and it's had continuing rioting on the streets, not least with the present yellow vests. This is not stable. This is not stability in a British sense. So having mentioned Britain, let me now turn, before lunch, to the question of Britain itself. I'm going to do 2 stories. The first, none of you have heard. The second, some of you have heard me say before. The first story is, I was on holiday between last Thursday and this Thursday in the West Country. I went down to see my brother in Bristol, who's just had his 70th birthday. And on Tuesday, my wife and I were sat in the sun, actually in the shade, at 33 degrees, on the promenade at Clevedon. Some of you know Clevedon in Somerset. We were sat at a very nice restaurant having a very nice fish salad lunch. And I'm looking out, and there's children playing on the beach, and there's the wonderful Victorian pier of Clevedon, the best pier in Britain. And it was lovely. And I'm sort of half dozing, really, over my cup of coffee at the end of the meal. And the news came through on my Twitter, telling me that Johnson was now our new Prime Minister. And I'm looking out at this scene of children on the beach, and the pier, and everything else, and a thought went through my mind, I don't know why. I thought of July, not 2019, but 1914. Everyone around was having a fantastic time, enjoying the sun, enjoying nice food, in a beautiful surroundings, Victorian Edwardian surroundings that haven't really changed since Edwardian days. And you could have been in 1913. When I came home, I checked up on eBay with postcards from pre-1914, and the front looked exactly the same as it did this week. And I thought of what? People enjoying themselves in that summer of 1914, oblivious about what was going to happen. Now, you may well disagree with what I've said, but what you can't disagree with, well, at least I don't think you can, is that a turning point in Britain's history in the immediate modern era of the 20th and 21st century was another July, the 1st of July 1916 and the Battle of the Somme. That changed this country forever. And our long decline began on that day, on that dreadful, dreadful day of the first day of the Somme. From being the 19th century world power, the largest empire the world had ever seen, eat your heart out, Caesar, the long decline had begun, paying the cost not of one world war but of 2 world wars, the loss of empire following the Second War, the collapse of British industry since 1950. During my trip to the West, I went back to Bristol, where I was born. I went to the suburb where I was born, which is called Fishponds in North Bristol, not a glamorous part. Those of you who know Clifton, it's the other side, you would never ever have been to Fishponds. And I just walked around and I'm thinking of all the firms that used to be there when I was a child in the late 40s and early 50s. There were friends of mine whose father ran a sheet metal works. There was our next door neighbour who ran a paint works. My father's family ran a leather business. My mother's family built railway engines. And there were lots of these. Do any of them survive today? Not a single one. The collapse of British industry in 1950s and early 60s. And then we joined Europe with Ted Heath. It seemed a very unlikely thing for us to do. But of course we were forced to do it because of the economic state that Britain was in. We'd even tried to join it before until de Gaulle said no. We had terrible economic problems and we were advised to buy British. Do you remember? And that dreadful, dreadful little man on television, Huey Green. Do you remember Huey Green? And he produced a record called I'm Backing Britain. And then he went completely mad on one live television programme where he had Union flags, RAF flags, people in uniform, after which he was taken away by men in white coats. Or at least ITV sacked him and he never appeared again. The cost of 2 world wars, the loss of empire, the collapse of British industry, and joining Europe, which we're now again leaving, is an indication of the long decline of Britain and the failure of our politicians to come to terms with that. You could say there were exceptions to that. Mrs. Thatcher, for all the mud slung at her, and I'm not a fan of Mrs. Thatcher, tackled mining, which was dead in the water. And we're still arguing the same old things when we have industries collapsing. I do not understand how the Labour Party can talk about restoring manufacturing in Britain. That's like restoring the medieval Catholic Church. It's gone. It's not coming back. But we masked our decline, which has been the most dreadful thing for us, I think. We masked our decline because we won 2 world wars against all the odds, and in particular in 1940. And we gained a seat on the Security Council of the United Nations, which we still hold. How much longer can the United Nations justify in giving Britain a seat on the United Nations Security Council? Our decline was masked because of the recovery of our economy after we joined the European Union, the common market. And our politicians, whether Labour or Conservative, denied the loss of power. Do you remember Harold Wilson on HMS, what was it, HMS Tiger, was it? Lion? Tiger. HMS Tiger in the Zimbabwe crisis. Crikey. And then there was pretending we were a major power. And of all things, the Labour post-war government of Attlee pursuing an independent nuclear deterrent. And Anar Bevan at a Labour Party conference says, you cannot send a British Foreign Secretary naked into the conference chambers of the world. Against Attlee's view that we shouldn't have an independent nuclear device. And now we are, for the first time, maybe since 1914, facing the reality. We're facing a reality as we leave Europe. Not the reality of Brexit itself, that's one issue, but the reality of the question, who are we? Who are we? Our constitutional structures are clearly failing. You can't have a Prime Minister elected by 130,000 people. It doesn't no longer make sense. You cannot have a constitution in which direct representation through a referendum is catastrophically at issue with representative democracy, the MPs in Parliament. We have no system to work out what we do when those two things don't coincide. And of course we've got constitutional crises over Northern Ireland because of Brexit, but over Scotland because of Scotland. And it's all grim. And I say this seriously and not as a joke. If at some point in all of this chaos, the Queen was to die, wow. The Queen's death is going to be of incredible importance. Not because of her particularly. As a person, we should be sorry, or most of us will be really sorry, to have lost her steadying hand. But what will be is a formal break with the past. A very big crunch break. I think this particular monarch's death will have more significance probably than any monarch's death that we've ever had. I think it's going to be nation changing. If we have a Labour government, we may well have a referendum on a republic, as both McDonnell and Corbyn are committed to republicanism. We may have problems over Charles's wife. There's a whole range of problems to come. But let's look at our constitutional problems here. I think the constitutional problems are very serious. We have seen the challenge to the executive, that is to say the cabinet, posed by one, the Speaker. We've seen the Speaker act in a way that no Speaker has acted since the time of the Civil War. And a challenge to the executive posed by the House of Commons, which challenged Mrs. May's government. So we have a challenge to the executive posed by the Speaker and posed by the House of Commons. And if the executive under Johnson ignores both and presses forward for a no-deal Brexit against the views of the House, then that places us in a very interesting constitutional position.
And the people.
Sorry?
And the people.
And the people.
Yeah. What about the people?
What about the people?
Yes. They were the ones who were given the right to vote yes in or out.
Yeah, but the problem is that no one had any rules about the referendum. And given
It doesn't
that,
matter. It's history. It happened.
well,
It's the law. It's the law. That's what happened.
well,
They were given the right to vote. Parliament.
it raises also, a long time ago, Plato said that direct democracy only resulted in the rule by the less educated over the educated. Long time ago in Athens. The problem with that is, of course, no one actually knew what leave meant. That's a very
They
clear.
were asked to leave or stay. They have voted to leave.
No, I think you'll find. It's not a question. Sorry, it's not a question of getting over it. It is a question of where we are now, and the fact that the executive has been challenged by the Speaker and the executive has been challenged by the House of Commons is a problem, because we have not had this situation since the 17th century, and that led to civil war.
What about if you can?
No, I think I must press on a bit. Now, we've changed our position over our Prime Minister. The Prime Minister was always, according to those of us of a certain age who did constitutional law, primus inter pares, first among equals. That has clearly changed in the two world wars with Lloyd George and Churchill. And when Churchill became Prime Minister in 1951, the Cabinet insisted that he went back to a position of primus inter pares. But, and of course Attlee was primus inter pares, but Thatcher and Blair have changed the prime ministerial position into what Tony Benn described as a presidential style of government. So we've got a problem about the cabinet and the prime minister, as well as about the relationship of the executive as a whole with the Speaker and with the House of Commons. We've even seen cabinet government break down under the previous prime minister with open cabinet rebellion and her inability or unwillingness to sack those who breached cabinet collectivity. And we've never seen that before. We've also got talk of taking politics onto the streets and through the media. Brexit Party has not one single MP, but according to the polls, is a serious contender in any new general election. But the Labour Party under John McDonnell favours breaking of parliamentary democracy and taking it to the streets. In 2017, McDonnell said, parliamentary democracy doesn't work for us, elections aren't working for us. We used to call it insurrection. Now we are polite and call it direct action. Let's get back to calling it what it is. It's insurrection. We want to bring this government down by whatever mechanism we have. Now, if the second major democratic political party in our country is denying democracy, then our democracy is in danger. Our democracy is in danger because of the presidential style of the Prime Minister. And it remains to be seen how Johnson works that one out. Our cabinet-style government has been challenged by the Speaker, has been challenged by the House of Commons, in the same way that the House of Commons and the Speaker challenged the executive of Charles I. We have never been in this situation since the 1640s. And we have the senior member of the opposition actually talking about insurrection on the streets. And we know that many civil servants are worried about civil unrest following Brexit. And I need to tell you the story I didn't tell you before coffee. When I was principal at the City Lit, one of my governors was Sir Peter Baldwin. Peter Baldwin had been Deputy Permanent Secretary in the Treasury and then Permanent Secretary in the Department of Transport. He was a real old-fashioned civil servant, quiet, unassuming, extremely intelligent. And one night, in the early 1990s, he and I were in my office at the City Lit. It was very late, and we were having a cup of coffee and just chatting. And I don't know how it started, but Peter said, I won't live to see it, but you may. There will be revolution in this country. And he said, I don't mean blood on the streets revolution, but our system of government cannot continue. And I rather dismissed it at the time. And I can't get it out of my head now, because this isn't a politician, this isn't a journalist. This was an extraordinarily senior, well-balanced civil servant of the old school. And he believed back in the 80s and 90s that our structure was failing. God knows what he would think now. I asked him what this revolution would be like. And other than saying it wouldn't be blood on the streets, what he said was, all I know is it won't start in Westminster. And what his actual words were, it will start in somewhere unlikely like Chipping Salisbury, he said. And I think he was, unfortunately, I'm now beginning to think he was right. Wow. Wow. To answer my friend here, David Davis said in October 2016, there will be no downside to Brexit, only a considerable upside. Michael Gove said in 2016, the day after we vote to leave, we hold all the cards and we can choose the path we want. Boris said in 2016, there will continue to be free trade and access to the single market. John Redwood said, getting out of the EU can be quick and easy. The UK holds most of the cards in any negotiation. Nigel Farage said, to me, Brexit is easy. And Liam Fox said, the free trade agreement that we will have to do with the European Union should be one of the easiest in human history. Well, I think whatever happens, it's not going to be easy and it's going to be difficult. It's going to be extremely difficult. In that article by Neil Ferguson, he wrote a paragraph which I found rather odd, and I'll share it with you. This is before Boris became Prime Minister, so he's thinking about that Boris will become Prime Minister. And he wrote, so an old Etonian is about to become Prime Minister because he looks to the manner born in the eyes of a tiny self-selected electorate and is willing to promise them the magical Brexit they still believe in. In reality, Brexit is an impossibly expensive and complicated divorce from a spouse who is terminally ill. It's like seceding from the Holy Roman Empire. In other words, Niall Ferguson is saying, this is not just a British crisis. This is a British crisis within a European crisis. And that's what I've been trying to say. And I found that paragraph slightly odd when I first read it. But I'm beginning to think that Niall Ferguson has touched upon something that is important. That the EU is damned, but coming out of it, we're damned. God, I hope that's wrong. You may think all of this is merely a temporary situation before return, Brexit or no Brexit, or whatever Brexit, to a more traditional position of a centre-right Conservative Party and a centre-left Labour Party. Or you may think it's not temporary, and it heralds the end of that era of 20th century politics and the beginning of a new era of coalition politics, which will stretch from the extreme left, Momentum, to the extreme right, Farage, and a mixture in between of parties that come and split on other issues, like the Greens. And you may think that it heralds an end of one part of our history, like the end of Tudor England or the end of Victorian Britain. Many commentators think so. But you may agree with my MP, Sir Peter Bottomley, Conservative in Worthing, who I've been having an interesting discussion with, who believes that, no, this is temporary, and we will return to what he believes is the normal political situation. That is to say, the pre-referendum two-party system of Conservatives against Labour, centre-right against centre-left. And he also believes that the union with Scotland will hold. But I have to say that increasingly Sir Peter's view is a minority view. Of course, it doesn't mean he's wrong. He could be proved right. You have to make your own minds up. Whether you hold optimism for the future or you're more pessimistic. Because whatever is happening, change is coming. Change is coming to Europe and change is coming to us. And we're going to have to deal with that change. And change, you can be optimistic or pessimistic about change. But if you're optimistic, you have to have a route through that change. And actually, if you're pessimistic, you also have to have a route through that change. And maybe Johnson is the one that has a route through if he returns to one nation conservatism. And perhaps the Labour Party do if they get rid of Corbyn and move to centre-left again. But that may not happen. Or maybe you think that the Liberals will burst through the middle. Well, you're welcome to believe that. Maybe you think the Greens will make a huge attempt. Maybe you think Farage. We are having change, whatever. But for those of us who are lawyers, the most important issue is constitutional change. Our constitution is no longer, as they say today, fit for purpose. We have to look seriously at constitutional change. We have not looked seriously at constitutional change since the Asquith Liberal government of pre-1914. We have to look. We've got the mess that Blair left us with a federal state that isn't a federal state, with parliaments in whatever they're called, in effect parliaments in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. And look where that has got us with Scotland. We've got the problem which has not been resolved now for over 100 years with the House of Lords. We cannot go on with that. We've got the problem, as I've said before, of constraining the executive and in particular the Prime Minister. And if we have a Prime Minister in Johnson who is reportedly has said that he will drive through Brexit by simply asking the Queen to prorogue Parliament, this is the action of Charles I. And we cannot go back to an absolutist, dictatorial Prime Minister. But how do we get back to an Attlee, Macmillan type Prime Minister? Is it possible? Sometimes it's not possible to go back, you've got to go forward. So what constraints can we place? And you're absolutely right, we've got to have something that says how we deal with direct democracy and representative democracy. Oh, it's been okay. Remember, we only had direct democracy because Harold Wilson wanted to get himself off the hook about Europe. But unlike Cameron, he actually did the job properly. And we voted to remain in, which was the decision taken by the Heath government without a referendum. And you remember the Labour Party was split in two, the Conservative Party was split in two. Wow, we cannot have referenda with different rules. 16-year-olds vote in Scotland, 18-year-olds in England. In Scotland, under Callaghan, it is over 50% of those actually voting. In England, 50% of those entitled to vote. None of it makes sense. And it doesn't make sense. Brexit would have made perfect sense if one of the political parties had been committed to coming out. Then there wouldn't have been a problem with the referendum. We've got a problem with the referendum because our elected representatives have taken it upon themselves to abandon representative democracy. It's seriously worrying. We've got that. Does that mean a written constitution? Well, no, not necessarily. Because if we have a written constitution, we should be in the wretched situation the Americans are in. With a law court deciding what is and what isn't constitutional, and the lawyers in the law courts appointed politically. This is another form of madness. So we've got a real problem about liberal democracy, and Putin is right. We have to work out how we cope with liberal democracy. What sort of democracy do we want to have? Are we all going to be given terminals in our lounges, and when we ask to vote, we press a button and it's immediately done? Well, I don't want a democracy like that, thank you. But you may. I put here the questions go on almost endlessly. But the one issue that will now be faced, but has been made more difficult by the Brexiteer right, is to acknowledge the harsh realities of Britain's 19th century empire. Find a way of living with our new analysis of empire in our multi-ethnic, multicultural society and moving on. We cannot go on. We cannot go on linked to this fantasy past in a society which is very different. In Bristol, where I was born in the city of Bristol, where you could have counted the number of black people, well, if not on the fingers of one hand, fingers and toes of both hands and both feet. And now, of course, it's very different. The world has changed. And as long ago as 1962, the American Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, said, Britain has lost an empire and has not yet found a role. 1962. And I think Acheson's words are as appropriate today as they were then. What is our role? Well, he thought our role was in Europe, but it clearly isn't now. So where is it? The lapdog of America? Well, hopefully not, and I doubt it. So where are we? So do I remain negative or positive? Well, I remain positive, oddly enough. Why? I remain positive about both Europe and Britain for the same reasons. Because of Europe and Britain's ability to experiment, to innovate, to discover, to learn, and to advance. We have done that since the Renaissance. Experiment with different forms of government, innovate, discover, learn, and advance. European and British culture are both strong. Our foundations are very strong, right back to the ancient world of Greece and Rome. And here in Britain, our democracy, which we fought hard for in the Civil War, and came to terms with, well, at least in England, without bloodshed. In 1688, with the arrival of William of Orange, and in 1714 with the arrival of George of Hanover. And it has served us well for 300 years. But it needs to be innovated and changed now. It's not holding up. But do I think we will change it? Yes, of course I do. Of course I do. Because we are those sorts of people. I think we will, in the end, be all right, but how long the end will be for both us and Europe, I can't tell. How we get over current crises, I don't know. This is Friedman. I'm looking at the clock, and with this I end. When you stand on the cliffs at Dover, you can pretend to see France and the European peninsula in the distance. I never actually have. You can also pretend to hear the rumble of traffic in the Channel Tunnel underneath your feet. This is the British paradox. On the surface, the English Channel guards the approaches to Britain, as it always has, keeping the European peninsula at bay. But the tunnel now binds Britain to the European peninsula, ignoring the Channel. This paradox crystallises the fundamental question in British history and strategy. Precisely what was Britain's relation to the peninsula? And the story of the peninsula's future depends at least partly on the answer to that question. Whether we're in or without, we are linked by geography. Churchill said if he could only drag this island into the middle of the Atlantic, the answer would be clear. We would ask to be a state of the United States of America. But we can't do that. And whether we like it or not, whether we're in or out, we're part of Europe. And Europe needs us as much as we need them. And it's going to be fascinating. As I've often said, I've promised myself I'm going to live to be 170 because I'm determined to find out what's going to happen. Thank you for listening this morning. It's 12:45. We re-adjourn at 2:15. And if no one's here, I shall... We reconvene at 2:15. And if you aren't here, I shall be only too pleased to talk to myself. So,